So I did. That being seen,
Will, shameless.
Yeah, nice to meet you. So yeah,
Just using the webcam for live now. Yeah.
Hi everybody.
Hello, folks. So we're going to get started in just a few minutes. A couple of quick logistical points I just wanted to make. So restrooms are downstairs and across the hall. For those who need to use the restrooms, we're going to be starting in just a few minutes, but feel free to grab food and we'll get started in just a bit. Thank you. Also, I just wanted to ask, ¿hay alguna persona que necesita traducción en español? Por si acaso se necesita, pueden levantar la mano. ¿Hay alguien?
I'm going to say I'm still on this one. It's just waiting.
Yeah, that one's not working for some reason. It says I need to download the program. It says I have one person watching. Try to so somebody's watching this.
Might be me.
I'm going to be filling out cards when it comes in.
Yeah, I was like, I got a picture of us. I thought I made it to the big leagues. Yeah. This is a new thing we do. It's an event.
So feel free to just we are testing this out, so usually we'll sort of record this. We're trying something out where it's actually it's a YouTube live. So we'll see how it goes.
Is it on now?
It should be. You guys look at
No, I already retweeted it. I was checking it. No, I don't have any kids. I'm only the one. I told you I'm going to come to you.
Okay, so good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming by and for spending, a Wednesday evening coming to something as perhaps dry as a policy talk. But we have a lot of really wonderful, I think, great folks in the audience today, as well as a wonderful panelist. So I'm really excited about the conversation, and particularly just to encourage us to really have just a sort of an open dialogue as much as we can about not only the topic that we set out, but really the whole reason why we started sort of these kind of events, the whole reason Polar started these, was because we were having these conversations with elected officials, with our nonprofit partners, with other folks who are active in the sphere around the river, around water, around community issues. And we really wanted to help those conversations come out to the public and give everyone else an opportunity to see them. The best conversations are those that happen, I think, a little bit intimately. We're also recording this event. The panelists will be able to watch it and sort of in its entirety everywhere, as well as hear your own questions, and forward it on to folks if you'd like. So really quickly, I think I just want to, first of all, thank you all for coming out again. We have a really, really great, wonderful panel. We're going to go through introductions a little bit. First thing, I would be remiss in not mentioning that events like this, of course, are only possible with the supporters that we have. So we do want to thank the Dorrance Family Foundation, the Resources Legacy Fund, as well as, sorry, what was the last one? REI, thank you, for helping make these possible. We use a pretty very light budget to make things happen, but ultimately, much nonprofits, like everyone else, sort of survives by the support that we get, and by having you all make sure that this is of value to you. So we'll certainly ask for your feedback afterwards. Please, feel free to contact us if you have any questions. And without further ado, I want to, invite our panelists to sort of come introduce themselves as we get into this discussion. Really quickly, any sort of questions about today's sort of formats? Any questions about where the logistics are, restrooms, anything? Okay, otherwise, just assume everyone is very knowledgeable. So my name is Stephen Mejia. I'm the Policy and Advocacy Manager, as I mentioned. So the way tonight is going to break down is we're going to spend the first hour roughly just talking to our panelists, really hearing from them, their perspectives, working in as elected offices, our community partners, as well as a few of the journalists and media who do a lot of the reporting on the issues that we hear about, particularly around ballot initiatives. And kind of start a conversation about the role that we each have in making public funding, such as Prop 68, happen. So for those who aren't familiar, Prop 68, which is the $4.1 billion bond that we just passed. I don't know if you knew that, but we all just passed it. Yeah, you can share it. So it's a pretty important investment in parks and in water across the state. And particularly important to this funding measure, it started with SB 5, with at the time the Senate Pro Tem Kevin De Leon really saw the need to see some of this funding go into projects that are desperately needed in communities where access to parks, access to open space, access to water infrastructure, and financing for these long-term efforts are really insufficient over time. And we know that this is an ongoing challenge for us. I think we're all keenly aware of what the environment, what the weather, what the temperature feels like, the climate challenges that we're going through in Northern California right now. A few years ago, we barely stepped out of a drought, and I think many of the science actually is pretty clean to point out that may not necessarily be out of it just yet. And we continue to have challenges in terms of where we get our water from. So Prop 68 was really a momentous and really important inflection point for us in making sure that we're publicly saying this is what our values are. Our value is about making sure that there is funding available, not wholesale, but there is some support from the state for these projects. And of course, Los Angeles, we had about $140 million coming here locally through conservancies. We had up to eligible for about $2 billion for different types of projects, whether it's parks in disadvantaged communities, access to sort of infrastructure, to trails, to transportation, as well as really, really necessary sort of climate resiliency and climate preparedness projects and programs. Now, all of that is fantastic and is good, but ultimately it comes down to the implementation of those funds, which is where we are right now. We went through this whole campaign together, and I'm going to let the panelists talk a little bit about that campaign, what each of our role in that conversation was, and then hopefully we're going to move on to kind of the broader thing, which I'm really hoping is sort of the meat and bones of today's conversation, which is, so where do we go from here? How do we, after we pass this measure, after we've said this is what we want funding for, how do we make sure we're delivering on the public good that we all feel we want, that we feel we need? If there is something that we're missing or there's something that's not meeting, how do we make sure we get there? And ultimately, how do we understand the role that each of us, from our institutions as well as to the public itself, what is the role that we each play in that? So that's kind of the broad things for today. And hopefully the most you'll have to hear me talk. So really quickly, so I'm just gonna start over on my right here. We're gonna start with Marissa and just, sort of pass it down, or, oh, she was already, sorry, change it up. So we're gonna start by introducing sort of our panelists, let them talk a little bit about who they are, where they're coming from, and then we'll get this started.
All right. Oh, mine's not on. That's okay, I can
See,
pretend.
just gonna get it right now.
Hello.
The volume needs to be a lot higher on that.
Hello? Oh, there I am. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the River Center. If you haven't been here before, it's worth a walk around. My name is Marissa Christensen. I'm the Executive Director of Friends of the Los Angeles River. Stephen already introduced himself, but I do want to give a round of applause to Stephen and the rest of our team here who made tonight's event happen. So FOLAR, I think a lot of you here in the audience are familiar with us to one degree or another. We are a river advocacy organization. We've been around now for 32 proud years. And we are the largest mobilizing force on the river. We do our river cleanups. We have river education program for youth. And we have a sort of policy and advocacy pipeline. We mobilize good citizens like yourselves to get involved in the decisions that are actually making change on the ground happen for our river. So one of the things that we did in that vein this year was a campaign for Prop 68. We worked with Lori Friedman's office, we worked with our friends at Los Angeles Neighborhood Land Trust to mobilize voters, educate voters around the benefit of a water and parks bond, the first of its kind in 14 or 15 years, something like that, because it's time. Right? Our environment needs a little bit of a boost. We're not getting a lot of current help at the federal level. This is sort of how we make things happen for California, and specifically for Los Angeles, has to start at home. And this particular bond, we were very excited about at FOLAR because it has $140 million of it for LA specifically, but upwards of $2 billion that the region of Los Angeles could be eligible for based on other criteria. Of that, about $100 million, give or take, is divided up between the two conservancies that really fund projects along the river. And that is the Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy, which actually is the landowner of this property that you're sitting at now, and kind of has the upper river, so to speak. And the San Gabriel Rivers and Mountains Conservancy, which has everything south of downtown LA. And there's a lot of projects that everyone here in this room have talked about and dreamt about and planned for over eons and decades, long before I was ever involved, long before many of us were involved. There's been this planning effort in place for restoring our Los Angeles River. And what we actually have now is a real opportunity to start seeing those projects be implemented. And it's propositions like this, it's financing like this that will actually start to make that real change. So I know we at FOLAR really, really want to see projects that open the river up to all Angelenos as a natural resource and repair habitat. So that means things like removing concrete along the channels, buying back some of the floodplain where that's possible, and just creating a more natural environment. So we're really excited to see that come down the pike.
So speaking of getting back land for sort of public access, there you go.
Yes, thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Keisha Sexton. I actually work at LA Neighborhood Land Trust. It's a long name. We were actually founded in 2002 as a way to address the lack of green spaces in low-income communities of color. Before I continue, by show of hands, how many of you believe that California is park poor? Okay, great. Good. We're all starting in a place where we all agree that, yes, California is park poor. unfortunately, and actually through the Measure A needs assessment, we learned that half of Angelenos do not live walking distance from a park. Yes, wow. And most of definitely LA County is either classified as high or very high need areas, meaning they need parks, their parks need improvement, and we need more resources. So for us, and that issue is exaggerated when you're in low-income communities of color. For me, I grew up in the Compton area, and we literally had to bike maybe 30 to 40 minutes to get to our nearest park. One, to get to our nearest safe park. And once we made it there, our parks were sort of our Disneyland because it had a big slide, it had a playground, and it also gave out free food back in the days. So for us, this reality, my experience growing up in LA County is not unusual for folks who look like me, and it's actually more common. And although I grew up in the 80s and 90s, this is still a reality for a lot of folks of color in 2018. So in 2002, when our organization started, it was actually started then by Eric Garcetti, who was a council member. After the 1992 uprising, or some folks call it the riots, the city of LA was looking at how do we respond to the vacant land or the lots that were burned down in the 1992 uprising, and they started a task force. That task force said that there needs to be an urban land trust that works on conserving land for parks and open green spaces. So since then, 2002, we have built a total of 27 park projects. They're pocket-sized parks. We do have some larger-sized projects, but the majority are pocket-sized parks. And it's a way to really make sure that every Angeleno, no matter your race, zip code, have access to a green space. And not only have safe green space. So in order to ensure that the spaces are safe, we also make sure that stewards are community or stewards of those park projects. Everyone from potential active gay members to the senior citizen, because it really takes a community to make sure that these park projects are safe. So for us, when Prop 68 conversation started, and when we were hearing Senator Kevin De Leon was working on SB 5, for us, it was obvious that it makes sense for us to be part of these conversations, to participate, because Senator De Leon has in the bill is potentially or specifically around making sure that communities that are park poor, communities of color have access to green spaces. Not only as a way to ensure that we have healthy, safe communities, but also with climate change, there's really a very high need for every community to have trees and access to these parks. So for us, it was definitely ideal for us to be a part of it. And the role that we played in Prop 68 was really making sure that voters were informed. Voters in the communities that we serve, from South Los Angeles to Koreatown to San Fernando Valley, really making sure that we're getting out the message in many different languages so that many different individuals can understand and be able to make an educated decision. We also did phone banks where we call all voters throughout California, or texting, which is a new thing nowadays, texting voters to make sure that they go out to the polls and make sure that they vote in support of Prop 68. We also went back to our park leaders and our park stewards because this is something that our park leaders have been fighting for the past 16 years, to let them know that funding is coming down. Because not only can we address this problem by building and designing green spaces, the reality is we're one organization. So we need a lot more resources and a lot more people power and a lot more organizations and agencies out here doing this great work. For us, it was really important to connect the dots for our residents to make sure that they're part of the process. So we worked very closely with FOLAR on some educational engagement. We worked with land trusts up and down the state of California, and also non-traditional environmental justice groups who may be focused on public safety or who may be focused on educational justice. So for us, it was important to say, yes, you might be trying to improve the quality of education, which is great, but let me also talk to you about why supporting parks is important and how can we connect the dots with quality of education with park justice. And another thing Senator De Leon always says is that access to parks is a civil rights issue. So we're really carrying that message and really making sure that communities of color have access to green spaces.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Laura Friedman. I'm the assembly member who represents this area. It's the 43rd. You're in the 43rd district. Welcome. You're coming from somewhere else. It's really an honor to be on this panel with people that have worked so long on these issues, and I really appreciate your inviting me to come here this evening. So I've been in the assembly now for less than one term, so about a year and a half. Before that, I was on the Glendale City Council for 7 years. So I guess this is the part where I'm supposed to talk a little bit about my involvement with the river.
Sure, yeah, I think we stepped into that really.
Yeah, we dived right in, which is great.
One question out of the way.
Yeah, so the river and issues about parks have been extremely important to me ever since I've been in public office. Now, Glendale's an interesting place because if you look at the statistics of parks per person, they're actually not that bad. But when you remember that the majority of the population lives below the 134, which is a much smaller landmass than the rest of the city, and that area is extremely poor, you realize that those statistics can be very misleading. So I've noticed for years that we have this tremendous population that live literally in the shadow of Griffith Park, but they can't get there. So I don't know how many of you live on this side of the river and this side of the 5, but that's a real physical barrier that disconnects people from Elysian Park and from Griffith Park. Now, if you live in central Glendale or even where I live in northwest Glendale, the only way that I can get to the dog park, to the zoo, to Griffith Park is by getting on the 134 freeway. Or I can drive through Burbank, which is a real detour, and have to brave Victory Boulevard, which is an on and off ramp to the highway. And if you're in South Glendale, you're stuck between the 134 or Los Feliz Boulevard, which is, never a great road to drive on except for maybe 3 in the morning when the park's closed anyway. And if it's rush hour, I'd say don't do it. And on the weekends when people are trying to access the park, I'd say definitely don't do it. And if you're on foot or bike, forget about it. I've biked that myself, and it's a death trap. I probably shouldn't say things like that, but it's dangerous. You've got the on-ramp and the off-ramp, and there's, it's really, really a tough commute. So, and yet you can almost spit and hit Griffith Park from the Glendale side. So my proudest accomplishment in my short time in the assembly was in the park bond, which I was a co-author of SB 5, being able to secure $20 million to create a bridge right next to the 134 freeway. Now, the footing of that bridge on the Glendale side has, get this, within 1 mile, 100,000 residents. 100,000 residents who can see Griffith Park, who live within a mile of Griffith Park, but cannot get there. So that bridge, which now is fully funded, almost fully funded, but Glendale will put up the money for the rest, will be able to get pedestrians and cyclists safely to Griffith Park. And on the other side, there'll be a shuttle bus that LA is planning to run around Griffith Park. So you can now, if you're going to the observatory or the Greek Theater, you can park on the Glendale side, walk 100 yards across the bridge and get picked up by a shuttle bus that will take you all around Griffith Park. So it's really a great project, and I'm very proud to have been able to be a part of that. Now, when I was on the Glendale City Council, I was also able to advocate for the version of the LA River restoration that was the most comprehensive version, 20.
Alternative 20. Yeah.
20. And I was glad that Glendale signed on in favor with a resolution in favor of that, because that's a project that's going to take a number of years, but it's going to be transformative for Los Angeles. And I assume that if you're here, you already agree with that to a large extent. And if not, I hope we have a Q&A so we can talk about it. So of course there's challenges, and I know we're going to talk about that. And there's things that people worry about, which are real things to worry about. But the ability to take areas of the city that are park poor, and a lot of the LA River goes through very park poor and economically disadvantaged areas, and to open that up as an asset for the community, where you have this incredible, unique amenity in Los Angeles of running water, which we don't have a lot of, but brings such an incredibly different experience to urban dwellers, as well as being essential for animals and migrating animals and for the ecosystem in this area. And to be able to bring that back is really an incredible prospect. So I'm looking forward to seeing that implemented, hopefully in my lifetime, certainly in my daughter's lifetime. But for the first time, this project that's been a dream for people for so many years is funded and planned and moving forward. With that, I'll stop and pass the mic. So again, thank you for having me.
Hi, everybody. I'm Emily Guerin. I'm the environment reporter at KPCC. And thank you to everybody who's a member, by the way. And if you're not, that's okay. Maybe you can change that afterwards. Just kidding. So I'm on this panel, I believe, because I have been reporting on the LA River a fair amount in the little more than 2 years that I've been at the station. And just in terms of sort of how we also cover things like ballot measures and elections, we at KPCC do this thing around every election called the Voter Game Plan and the Human Voter Guide, who is my colleague, Mary Plummer. She's our politics reporter. And so we really actively try to answer people's questions so that they can feel empowered and not intimidated when they look at the ballot, which is, I know, how I feel a lot of the time. It's so long. And so one of the things we try to do is just find out what questions people have and try to answer them. And I try to do that as well with, like the topics that I picked to cover. So one thing I'm actually hoping to get out of this is sort of your ideas about what questions you have about the river that somebody like me could answer. So I'll leave it at that for now, but I would love to talk to some of you about what you would like to know about the river.
Perfect, yeah, and I don't want to hold this up from that because I think, first of all, can we give our panelists a round of applause? So I won't be sort of coy about it, and I'll just tell. So the way we put this panel together was really thinking about the Zabala Initiative and how it passed. So the role that nonprofit advocates play, community advocates play in terms of hearing what some of those community values are, and really kind of helping legislators put those into policy. Legislators help really craft that into language that's implementable, that's defensible, that's legal. And really turns that into policy that then gets financed. And I think I'm really excited and happy about having Emily here because I think an institution that I think honestly we don't spend enough time thinking about, especially here locally, is journalists and journalism and what the role they play in really ensuring that democracy works. I can't think of the number of times, especially nowadays, where I've looked at really great old institutions, 130, 140-year-old newspapers that are covering issues that are getting into the details around issues that we otherwise would not know about. I want to call out specifically, there's a good friend of ours named Sammy Roth, who just did a great article in the Desert Sun talking about the Waterloo Imperial Valley. It's long, it has 3 chapters. I think it's some of the longest reading I've ever sort of run into, but phenomenal in terms of the investigative reporting that's being done. And I think we don't give enough credit to our journalists for that. And I think I'm really happy to have Emily here to kind of give us a frank perspective on where some of that information is coming from and what's the role that we all play in accomplishing that. So I kind of just want to pick up on a couple of the notes that we're hearing. We certainly covered Prop 68 well enough. And I think now the question is, I have sort of 2 thoughts in mind. One is, how do we actually make sure that then actually does what we need it to do? So what's the implementation? Where do we go from here? How do we interact with the implementation of those funds? From the community groups as well as through elected officials to as well, how are we tracking these issues from the public sphere perspective? I think Emily brings up the really great question of what do we care about? How do we track what those community values actually are? We have this funding available now. What are the kinds of projects we want to see and how do we sort of hold ourselves accountable to that? So I'm just going to throw it out to anyone sort of that has a response or reaction. So on the one hand, there's, what do we do now? So the funding is passed. What do you see from your perspective? What do we move from here in making good projects happen? And I think the other question I have is, how do we make sure that the community values, not just that we're hearing, but that we're actually trying to pay attention to collect the feedback, collect information, so that it's not just an imposition of values, but really we're trying to reflect what community values are. So anybody wants to take it from there? Sorry, I know that's kind of wrong.
First of all, I think that the communication between the policymakers and the different departments at different communities that are going to be implementing and creating the projects and the communities has to be really strong. And it's not always strong enough. It's really easy for policymakers to say, well, we're going to spend money on a new playground and replacing an old playground without actually going and talking to the moms and saying, well, Do you like this playground? Maybe they really love it. Just because it's 10 years old doesn't mean that it's not beloved in the community. So having that connection to find out what the community really values now and what they feel isn't working so well. And one thing that I will say, I think is not working well in a lot of areas in Los Angeles is the connection between communities and their existing parks. So I would like to see a real focus on things like connecting Elysian Park to the LA River, connecting communities to Griffith Park to where everyone doesn't have to drive there, connecting communities to amenities that already exist, making sure that they're utilized and well used, and finding where the impediments are. You know, quite often you'll see a really great park, and if you try to really walk there, it's very unsafe to get there because the roads were not engineered to bring pedestrians and cyclists to these parks. And then on the other hand, a lot of the parks don't have adequate parking. So they end up being really self-limiting because people just say, I'm not going to go because it's such a hassle to get there. And when I get there, I may not be able to park. I'll tell you, my neighborhood park in the area I live has permit parking all around it. So you literally can't park there if you don't, unless you can walk there or you happen to have a parking permit for that area, you can't access the only park that's near my house. I personally think that's unacceptable. You know, that was paid for by public dollars. How dare the city say that every resident who's a taxpayer can't access the park? And if you're not going to allow people to park, then you have a responsibility to get them there. And there's a lot of places in Los Angeles where for pedestrians, there's no crosswalk to access the entrance to a park. I mean, you're all nodding your head because you know this. And so how come the people who designed the parks never thought about that or aren't thinking about it now? Or if they are, maybe they just aren't connected to the funding sources. So we as a community really have to identify that and focus on that connectivity. And then looking, of course, at the park port areas. And it's a challenge, and I'll jump into challenges. I know we have a challenge part. I'm going to just jump to the challenges.
That's totally okay, yeah.
In the dense areas, and I'm just going to pick on South Glendale because I know it well. So you have this really dense area that's also extremely park poor. And you have a natural conflict between different needs of the community. So you have the park need, and we hear it all the time from people. But you also have a housing need. So are you willing to take housing out or housing land off the table to create the park? And to me, it's not acceptable to pit housing against parks. We have to find a better way. Then you have a third problem where in a lot of these dense areas, particularly in Los Angeles, because they are the only places that we allow density, because we've limited density so much in Los Angeles, the land value is astronomically high. So a city is not going to go in and compete against a private developer for that land because they just don't have the money. So what they say is, hey, we've got $5 million for land purchase. We can buy a postage stamp in South Glendale, or we can buy an acre in North Glendale. Guess what wins? The acre in North Glendale. The problem is they already have enough parks, and they're single family, so the kids can already play in their backyards in most places. It's the kids in the apartment buildings that really need the parks and the people in those communities that really need to access the parks. So how do we balance that land cost against the housing need and the desire for parks, which of course are land heavy? So that's, you know, something we need to really be smart about.
And so I think that that's a perfect pivot to Keisha, because I think the Los Angeles Neighborhood Land Trust, the conversations that we've had, yes, you're negotiating that not just in communities that have insufficient means to have access to parks and to have access to their sort of single-family homes. We're talking about communities that don't have access to park and don't have access to homes. Yeah. How does that conversation play out there?
Yes. Can I come back to that? Because I also want to
go ahead.
I also want to just answer the first question, which is what we can do to make sure that those resources are coming to us. And then I think it kind of all
sounds like something we're saying get involved.
Yes, I was going to say get involved because I think once we pass something, we can't think our work is done after that because the work is actually in the implementation of it. So internally, we're having conversations as well with our state groups about how can we influence guidelines. If there are guidelines, how can we influence them? And I like the point that you made about making sure that we're having conversations and making sure those conversations continue and making sure that we're talking to the right folks. Sometimes our electeds are the best people to talk to, but also the department agencies are also really great people because they have, at the end of the day, power to shape how this money is going to fund or circle back down to the communities. So I would say definitely stay involved, stay engaged, follow how imitation goes, and making sure that your voice is part of the process is definitely critical as we, as voters and as citizens, pass laws, just making sure it gets implemented the way we voted for it. In regards to the challenges and in regards to anti-displacement, so one of the challenges, and as a park agency, we're definitely in the middle of, is really figuring out, one, the unintended consequences of building parks. Fortunately, the small pocket parks that we build have yet to contribute to gentrification or displacement, but the reality is when big parks are built, property value goes up. So we're part of a group of CBOs that's really working to really look at all the funding that is going to come down from the state of California to the county of Los Angeles and how that funding could potentially unattendedly displace folks. So we're looking at historically, if you go back to Central Park in New York, that park unfortunately led to displacement and communities getting pushed out. And it was most likely poor folks that were of all ethnicity and all demographics. So we don't want that to continue to happen. And we also don't want that to happen here along the LA River. And I know Stephen and I was part of the Lower LA River work group, which is part of a lot of our conversations as development is coming in. How do we make sure that those communities who are currently there be able to take advantage of it? And we're going to be releasing something very soon, a white paper with our partners, where we're proposing some solutions. And one of the solutions, not specifically how it relates to Prop 68, but how it relates to park funding in general, is that there's also like 8 park agencies are required to think about how they will prevent displacement as a result of that park project. So it's really changing the discussion. And actually, we were meeting with county parks today, as well as Supervisor District 2, Mark Ridley Thomas' office, to really talk about, like, we have an opportunity as we're implementing Measure A, which was the county park funding, to really talk about how the park agencies themselves could be having discussions about anti-displacement. So it's not siloed. Is really all of the departments working collectively together to make sure that we're building quality of life or quality neighborhoods that everyone can thrive in. So I just really think it's about not really figuring out how we can make sure that everyone has access to the communities and how we can also build parks and how we should not put parks and housing against each other, but every community, every resident deserves to have both.
Can I just say one thing? I just have to, just to clarify something. When I was talking about the Glendale example, I didn't want to imply that Glendale has not been focusing on South Glendale, because several years ago when I was on the council, we actually decided to put almost all of our park money into South Glendale and created several new parks wherever we could in South Glendale, and also work with the school district. So if you don't have a lot of land, but there are some people that have land, and one of them is the school districts. So what the city did was invest money to turn their school grounds into community parks, so that during the day the schools had it, but then as soon as those schools closed, or like at 3 o'clock, the gates would open for the community. So there are ways that you can capitalize on amenities that you already have in the community. So I didn't want to, in case anyone from Glendale was listening, Glendale's actually done a really great job investing in South Glendale over the past, probably 10, 15 years. So,
Yeah, and third, Emily, yeah.
So I had an interesting experience. Before I moved to California, I was a reporter in North Dakota, and I covered before I moved to California, I reported on the oil and gas industry in North Dakota. And I found it very interesting the way that, a very, very red state and a very, very blue state approach funding for things like parks or really sort of funding anything at all. And in North Dakota, as a reporter, the sort of problem was, industry having a lot of influence on government and a lot of, regulations that perhaps weren't as strict as they could be, and also maybe a lack of funding of local government services, sort of a very hands-off, limited government approach. In California, I find it sort of the opposite in that elected officials here, no offense, like to throw money at problems because it's a liberal state. And so for journalists, the challenge here is following the money and making sure that it's actually spent in the ways that, you know, the people who voted for it sort of, like making sure it actually happens. So that was not the case in red states where they just weren't throwing money at things as much. And so in terms of like making sure, okay, X percentage of this ballot measure is supposed to go to disadvantaged communities, you see language like this in a lot of the things that come out of Sacramento, like the cap and trade bill, the big climate bill, a pretty high percentage that I don't remember off the top of my head, has to go to, you know, some has to go into disadvantaged communities, some has to go near disadvantaged communities, some just has to benefit disadvantaged communities. And like how you keep track of those things is very difficult. And so part of what we try to do is kind of do that accountability. But I have to tell you, it's very challenging and it's very time consuming. And we get sidetracked a lot by other kinds of breaking news. And so, but that is something that, like, I have this goal that for 2 years I've been saying I'm going to look into how the cap and trade money is spent and make sure it's going to the right places. And it's just a huge undertaking. But that's what we try to do.
I would love to actually piggyback off of that exact thing, because I think you've heard from all of us, the big answer here is get involved, stay involved, right? But what does that really mean? I think for us, who are all professionals in this field, it's our job to stay involved. We are at a lot of these tables that we're talking about, helping to craft guidelines and things like that. But it's hard even for us to keep track of it. So let alone the public, who you've got other stuff to do, you've got your own jobs. And there are umpteen different agencies in the case of the river that are responsible for taking the Prop 68 funding and actually using it to implement. So how do you keep track of all those agencies, what their guidelines are, how they're hearing from the community? And I'm going to actually put a little bit of it, not just on our elected officials hearing from their constituents, but on us. As a community-based nonprofit, one who takes its cue and its power from its base of supporters, it's our job in everything that we're involved in to make sure that we're not just at the table, but we're communicating back out to you. And we're telling you what agency is about to pass guidelines, or we're telling you what agency is considering, what park project, and where that public meeting is going to be, and maybe even giving you kind of comments that we recommend saying in those public realms. And so our staff at FOLAR has a mandate, right, that anything we are politically involved in needs to somehow be fed back to our community. And it's a daunting task, but I think for all of you out there who maybe at this point is like, well, okay, great, they're saying get involved, but what does that mean? I hope at the very least it means that you stay in contact with each of the organizations and offices represented up here so that you know where your energies can go.
So that's perfect. I want to pivot to, we're talking a little bit about challenges, but I think, in describing what the role of nonprofits, the role that FOLAR does, the role that other nonprofits, we neither are all similar in terms of our organization statements. We also don't have the same capacity. Different communities have different kinds of representation, different focuses. And so it's an imperfect system. We're trying our best to make sure some of these things get implemented. But I think this is the part where we should invite kind of the conversation of how do we hold ourselves accountable to acknowledge where those needs or community values, where the resource is not being met, or where the intellectual knowledge or the policy is not implementing the things we know we need to address things like gentrification, displacement. Green gentrification is talked about a lot more recently. I think I'm hearing a lot of the term come up in terms of our planning meetings. Equity gets thrown around a lot now. And I think in very many ways, equity is incredibly difficult to define on any issue, but we're still trying to use it as an aspirational term, which is great, but it's got to be more than just aspirational. And I think this is really where we need the support of nonprofits, elected officials, our reporters as well. We need to have sort of that frank conversation of what are we missing? And so I think it would be great to hear from each of you, you know, what's the feedback, what's the mechanism that you are willing to sort of hear the community's input on, and where are we sort of grounding ourselves and ensuring that we're not missing something when we're proposing a project or moving forward on something, that we're actually trying to make sure we're accomplishing all those aspirations, or meeting, you know, this member brought up, you know, park design. That park is being designed with changing community needs, changing forms of transportation, changing density elements. How are we responsive to those kind of issues?
I'm going to try to answer it, and then if I don't, please feel free to ask questions to get me to the point. So for us, as a community-based organization, we are rooted with working with community members. So as an organization, we don't just helicopter into a neighborhood and say we're going to build a skate park. We actually start with a blank sheet of paper and ask the community what would they like to see. So if you go to each of our 27 park projects, they look completely different. And they all reflect the demographics and the diversity of the communities that we work in. So that's one way that we as an organization is being responsive, and also, you know, being realistic and holding ourselves accountable and not saying that we're the experts and that we know what the community wants. Or I lived there 15 years ago, so I think this community deserves what I wanted when I was a child. That's not the reality. So we really start with the community. And when, as an organization, when we started working on policy, it was staff-led, and that's something that we did some reflective thinking on and really realized that in order for our demographics, in order for our community members that we work with, we really have to have a bottom-up approach. So we're currently working on a strategic plan. And in that strategic plan, we're identifying roles that community members can play to help us identify the policies that we work on, or to create a policy or a process within our organization. So before we say we're going to support Yes on 68, that we actually stop and talk to residents, and that we actually get their buy-in, or we actually have a conversation or a dialogue about, you know, what is Prop 68? How can Prop 68 help us? What are the challenges, et cetera, et cetera. And then also going back to the community after Prop 68 gets passed and really talk about how Prop 68 is going to impact their day-to-day life. So for us, we actually had to have an accountability session with ourselves to be really honest about, like, our policy work has yet to really have this bottom-up approach. And that's something that we're really having conversations about in our strategic plan, and really making sure that it's led by the community. Did that answer your question?
Yeah. So
okay.
It's kind of reflecting on, you know, I think from each of our positions, we can feel and sense the gaps.
Yes.
And the question really is, how are we making sure that we're being responsive to those
yes.
needs as they're coming up, as they change?
And I also think, you know, I know we love to hold our electeds accountable, but it's also holding nonprofits accountable, right? Because we're an organization, we're an entity, we're busy, but sometimes we may have oversights and we may forget to stop and ask. And actually, it was our community residents who said, hey, you guys always come to us about this policy, but you never come back. And we were like, oh, okay, we better come back. So it's about listening. It's about being open and honest, and really creating a space for community residents to also hold us accountable. Because in the end, we want to do good, but sometimes in the busyness of it, we forget.
I definitely agree with that. And we sort of have had a similar approach where our policy agenda has long been staff-led, but in the past couple of years, we've really endeavored to get back out into the community, use our education programs, which are boots on the ground programs where we're talking to even young children who have their own perspectives on the river and what that experience is for them. But also some of our staff, Stephen and some of the others here, regularly attend things like neighborhood council meetings or local workshops, where really our role is to listen and to try to distill what the general tenor of a given community is. Especially in a complex body of water like the river, which is 51 miles long and flows through umpteen different cities. the different desires and different needs of each of those communities really vary. So it is a challenge. It's a challenge because we know full well we're never going to be able to address every single desire or need that comes up, right? But what are the things that kind of percolate to the surface that we know we can help have an impact in? It certainly isn't a perfect process that we have, but it's one that we are committed to. We really see ourselves as kind of the conduit for information between our government agencies and distilling that to the community and then taking it back the other direction as well.
Thanks. So I'll piggyback on both of those really excellent comments. So as an elected official, my role is a little bit different than the nonprofits. It's different than it would be at the city level from city staff. And I'll say a few different things. I'll say, first of all, these projects a lot of times happen because of a need in a community, right? So the first thing you have to do is really identify what the need is in the particular community. Is the need to access or lack of access? Is the need just there's not enough parks? And you have to start with the fundamental value that everybody in every community deserves a safe and accessible park, particularly for children. And sometimes there's other voices that are at odds with that. And I'll give you a real-world example again that happened in Glendale, actually just before my tenure. A park poor community in South Glendale wanted a park, and they identified a piece of land that had a small structure on it that was a historic structure that was beloved to the community. It was right in the middle of their little business district. The business district there's not a lot of parking in that area, the same reason there's not a lot of parks. It was an old neighborhood, built turn of the century, wasn't built for a lot of cars on the street. So the business strip had always struggled with a lack of parking. So they really wanted this piece of property for a parking lot. Wanted to tear the structure down and put a parking lot. The residents around there said, hey, we'd like to have a park, and we like this structure. So you immediately have this tension between the two. They both can't win. So I think it was really up to the elected officials at the time to look at the community and say, what's the real need here? Yes, the business has needs, but the residents have a really profound need that affects many, many people and that we can't solve any other way. And the parking problem, you actually could kind of solve it in some different ways. You could maybe change some of the parking. You could have public transportation. There's things that you could do. But the park, there's nothing nearby. So they went ahead and they had their vision of turning this historic structure into a park with that as the centerpiece. And they just stuck with it. And they had to tell that business group, we're sorry, you're not getting your vision. We're going with this other vision. Now, that could have slowed this down forever. It could have slowed it down to where it didn't happen. And of course, it slowed it down for a while. But when you have visions that are at odds, the policymakers, the elected officials' role is really to say, what is the more pressing need, and what would really enhance this area the most with the land use decision? And once you set on that, you just have to go like gangbusters to get there, because it's so easy to derail projects with just the talking about it forever. So I'm not disagreeing. I think that, to get to that point took a lot, a couple of years of communication and identifying and complaints and, and people expressing the need and what they needed in the community. And I'll tell you what, that project, which is the Palmer Park, the gas station in Adams Square, is the showpiece of that community. And the side effect is the business is there much better than before the park, because now the whole community walks down every single day. The moms hang out in the park with the kids. The little coffee shop was able to open because people needed to go and get caffeine because the kids were tiring them out. And people noticed the dry cleaner. Maybe they didn't notice it before because they were driving past it. So sometimes as an elected official, you kind of have to just say, you know what, we're done talking, and now we're going to implement. So I think that that's really important sometimes to know when to make that break and just to move forward. And to bring it back to the river, we're kind of at that place now, I think, with a lot of the river. It doesn't mean we don't address concerns, and there's, concerns. But I would hate to have someone say, we're afraid of displacement, so we're not going to upgrade this community and give them a park or another amenity. The displacements can be real, and gentrification is real, but they're different problems. You can deal with that in a different way, but you don't do it by sort of saying we're going to give people lesser quality of life because we don't want this to be a nicer neighborhood. I would just sort of reject that at its core always. If you're worried about that, I'm going to give you the park, but I'm going to find a way to protect your residences or to add the housing that we need, because you should have the best quality of life you can get. You know, you should be in a neighborhood people want to live in, you know, no matter what your socioeconomic level. And we need to find a way to make that happen. And then to not have areas that people end up in just because they're horrible to live in and no one else wants to live there, right? So. Yeah.
No, and I think, Emily, how does that, so I want to get into the Q&A section because I think that's going to be really interesting to hear some thoughts and reflections from folks. But I'm wondering if you could just share some thoughts from, you know, a report's perspective. You're listening constantly to the community's voice, it sounds like. So in a way, you're trying to investigate what are some of the perceptions, what are they rooted in? What are some of the common threads that we see? So what's that process like for you in terms of trying to uncover what is the story that's going on here? Because I think, as has been described, you know, these things can happen behind closed doors or out of the sort of public view. And I think reporters really bring that out to everyone. So I'm wondering if you could describe that.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. I feel like what you guys in particular were describing is the sort of like democratization of who you listen to and where you get your ideas from. And that's happening in journalism as well. And it's not always easy because reporters and editors can be very proud and very protective of our ideas and think that we have the best story ideas. And there are a lot of really great stories that do just come from the brains of reporters, from like something weird someone says in passing while you're interviewing them about something else, and you just get this like spidey sense that you should look into it, and then you do, and then there's like something bad happening. I mean, that happens. But I think that increasingly we are acknowledging that we are not like the masters of our subjects and the experts, and that you guys have a lot of great questions that if we just listen to you more, that would be better for everyone. And so we have this whole, like, it's kind of jargon that I hate, but we call it like our audience first approach. But what it really means is just like we did this last year with the wildfires, like the crazy wildfires in December. We just started answering people's questions about the fires for like 3 days straight, and found that people asked a lot of questions that we wouldn't have thought of, but were actually like really interesting. And so we're trying to do that more. And there's different tools we have, like besides just social media, to solicit questions. But yeah, just sort of like the democratizing of journalism.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so I want to open it up really to questions from the public now, just to hear sort of the thoughts that folks have. So does anyone, I guess we're just going to ask for a show of hands, and then we're going to go from there. I guess, and I sort of already did enough questions I was asking, but I think for me it was really interesting to hear kind of what the challenges are, where we go from here. So I'm hoping that everyone sort of picks up on what are based on what we heard tonight, what are some of the things that we are hearing or maybe not hearing that should be addressed sort of in this kind of forum. So really quickly, I'll start right over here.
First of all, thank you so much for all participating. This is incredible. Wow, what a powerhouse. My name is Jackie, and I'm part of a group in Atwater Village that is very, very concerned about development along the river. And we formed a community group called Atwater Village Always. And one of the questions I have about just sort of in terms of this forum, what's the next step? Now, money's been earmarked, and now how are we going to spend it? And I was just wondering, we're obviously in an area where developers have bought up the land with lots of information that they gathered in the last 10 to 12 years and are so excited about developing housing along the river and other developments along the river. And I was wondering, how do we approach developers to emphasize what a positive move it would be to decide to sell otherwise developable land to the public for the types of projects you all are talking about? Is there a positive PR spin that could our collective minds come up with that? And or ways to convince or incentivize developers, because I love all these ideas, but when you're the residents dealing with the development and then you go to the meetings at the neighborhood council and you say, hey, what about a park instead? And everyone just laughs at you like, ha, ha, ha. Can you imagine? That would make no money. But there is money to purchase the land. And help.
I am really glad you asked that question. It's as though you were planted here by one of our team. So we also have the same concerns, and part of the reason. So we're certainly not anti-development. There is good development. We do have a housing shortage in LA that does need to happen. Our concern as FOLAR is that as we've created this river movement and we've looked at river restoration and all of this new attention has come to the river banks, some of that attention is coming from development that will privatize the river banks. And that's not what we're about. That's not why we're in this game. So actually in South Atwater Village, there is a piece of property that has been purchased. It's on the river. It's 10 acres. It's just south of Fletcher, and it's called the Casitas Lofts. It's 419 units of mostly market rate housing on the river and right next door to the Bowtie parcel, to Rio de Los Angeles State Park and to Taylor Yards. So you're talking about 100 acres of open space that ourselves and many of the other advocates in this room have long fought for. And now here comes a huge developer who's going to develop this land, and we don't see the development being something that actually benefits the community and some of the other concerns that they have. And so we're going to those meetings and we're standing up and saying exactly that. You know, what about a park instead? And there are these resources that are available, Prop 68 and other funds, through other agencies that are available to potentially purchase this land for the benefit of public good. So in terms of a positive PR spin, I hope that's a positive PR spin for us, for you, for the other community groups that are standing with us. I invite you to get involved with us on that particular project. But what's happening right now in this section of the river is this is one of the only sections that does have large swaths of land right next to the river that aren't currently completely built up. This is one of our only opportunities to remove concrete and to buy back some of the floodplain. And I think we have to get it right. And I think some of these projects could be precedent setting, and that there's other parts of LA or other parts of the river that are maybe a little bit more appropriate for what we're talking about. And so the tools that we have, you know, sort of in our toolbox is coalescing community groups like yourselves, all speaking with one voice, working with our elected officials to find funding to potentially incentivize developers to sell the land back, and coming up with a alternative vision for what that land could be and what it could mean to the community. So I don't think that's the best answer for here's how we fight it all together, but I think there's a few of these precedent-setting projects that we do really have an opportunity for everybody in this room to work on together now.
Any other questions? Yeah, definitely. Okay, so I'll zigzag down the aisle. Oh, sorry.
Hi. I want to piggyback on the Atwater area. I live in the valley, and I have great concerns. I'm following all this urbanization, LA, and I have lots of questions and issues in regard to it. But one of the things that you guys were talking about, you mentioned the removal of the cement in certain portions of the river. At some point, whether it's city, county, state, whatever it is, somebody needs to take a look at where they allow developers to build. Are we going to build in forests that burn down all the time, and you know, we have to put all this money and resources in rebuilding the communities and all of this? My concern is developers start building along the river, displacing people that are already there so they can put up big units. And then we have a big flood. We've worked out the concrete, and now those units are in danger. At some point, somebody has to take responsibility. It's not all about grit. You know, it's not the green we want is not the same green that legislators want. So we have to do something that protects the community and gets us along the goals we want and stop these developers. Yeah,
Who wants to take that question?
Well, I'm not sure if the question's about the safety and the engineering of removing concrete, and I have heard that as a concern from people.
So I think the question, if I can paraphrase more broadly, is what if for these climate challenges and other things that we know are impacting certain areas, we know that we have these challenges, is there a way, and I think this is the question that we have on the river all the time because it's so interconnected with water, wastewater, stormwater, water quality, flooding, is what is the role of land use and how do we put together a plan that really lays out what our goals for the reaches are, given that we have not only short-term needs but also these long-term challenges as well.
Right. So I can't comment on to that. I couldn't tell you where they should be removing, but they should have a plan. I mean, there should be engineers who look and make sure that the areas are safe and that I've seen plans where in the parks they're stepped and that they can close parts of them during flood events and where the rainy season and open other parts when the water's low. And you're absolutely right. We have to make sure that if there's going to be development anywhere near these areas, that it's environmentally sensitive and it's safe. Totally agree. And I'll just say in terms of development altogether, because that's a whole other topic and we could spend 20 hours discussing development in Los Angeles. But I'll say this, I think part of your question gets to something that's really important, and that's a fundamental problem in the city of Los Angeles right now, which is really outdated general zoning plans that haven't really taken a look at where we should be growing and where we shouldn't be growing. And we need to build and we need to grow. And the resistance a lot of people have is that we haven't really done a really good idea of where we want to do it because it enhances communities. So it kind of ends up willy-nilly everywhere where it just ends up, getting everyone upset. And there are areas that really could use it. I mean, there are areas that in the middle of Hollywood where I represent that are completely unwalkable and unbikeable because you're walking past a parking lot and a donut shop on a half an acre. And, there's so much land. And I live part of the year in Sacramento now, in Midtown Sacramento. That's a very dense area that is totally walkable, totally bikeable, beautiful, tree-lined, a mix of Victorians and apartment buildings, new apartment buildings, 12 stories, and old ones that are 6 stories. And yet it has more density, but it's so much more walkable than Hollywood. So it can be done right. We haven't done it right in Los Angeles. Now, LA has been updating their general plans, and they've been doing the communications and the charrettes and working with the neighborhood councils and the communities. But they are stymied at adopting these general plans. They've run into a wall because when they've tried to adopt them, they're being hit with CEQA lawsuits over and over again. So remember about having that vision and at some point moving ahead with it? We're at that place now where LA has got to find a way legally and with the blessing of the community to move ahead with some of these, to say we don't want to develop in these sites. We want these for the community. But here's these other sites where we'd actually enhance the community by allowing the housing to come in and mixed use and new shops and all of that. Because the opportunities are there. We're an enormous city. We're huge. We have so much land and so much opportunity. We just don't have that planning infrastructure in place to do it. So my very long answer to you is, yes, it's not being necessarily done well, and we need to really do that planning and have that vision as a city or as a series of cities or a series of communities and move ahead with it.
I think that's the key, the series of cities. I think one of the reasons why we don't have that plan right now is that each and every government agency, of which there are many, who own land in or along the river, do their own plans. And they only look at the properties that agency owns. And so what you end up with is a really piecemealed approach that doesn't actually look at the holistic impact to all the different elements of a given region.
I think that's been the biggest theme for me in reporting on the LA River is that everybody's in charge and so nobody's in charge. whether it comes to who's responsible for, notifying people when water quality is bad, or who's responsible for actually improving water quality, period. It's like, okay, you guys know off the top of your head, what is it, 51 miles in 17 cities? Okay, so that's a lot of jurisdictions, including the county, and then you throw in a couple of federal agencies. And so I've heard, the idea thrown around that there should be some sort of like, general agency that is like centralized, and I understand that hasn't happened yet. But so many people have mentioned this to me in my reporting. This whole like, if it's everyone's job, it's no one's job.
I want to say that I was part of a bill that passed this last year to create an upper LA River working group, and the whole goal, and there isn't a lower LA working group, and the whole goal is to get these agencies at the same table, because they haven't been. The disconnect, I can tell you from the city council side, the disconnect from one city to the next is profound. You've got siloed governments. With these smaller cities, you have part-time city councils that are basically volunteers who are there once a week. And then there's, staffers doing whatever they're doing who aren't really empowered to make big policy decisions when it comes to district or intergovernmental agencies. So what we have, for instance, for regional transportation with SCAG, with Metro, doesn't exist for this giant sort of park that's about to be created to the city. So the working group is an attempt to get everyone to the same table and to have them start to communicate and then start to do this planning. But I agree, I think it could be more formalized in the future and, a more rigorous kind of process, because you're absolutely right. And we've allowed the private developers to just set up wherever the land was available, and the zoning has not really, is old. It's sometimes 30 years old in some places, 40 years old, not anticipating LA River being anything except, a drainage ditch, which is what we're trying to, move back from. So, so it's going to take, when you have that many cities, I mean, have any of you ever tried to like plan Thanksgiving dinner with your family? So, you can imagine what it's like.
I know this is bad moderating as well, but I also just want to add, I think something that was mentioned before in terms of the plan that we encounter all the time, and certainly I think several of you who I know in the audience who've been working on this, in terms of the level, so not only is there silos in terms of the government and the regulatory structure that's supposed to implement these things, but I think in terms of the expertise, so who's at the table? Do we have staff biologists as much as we have engineers? Do we have public health involved in making planning decisions? Do we have other levels of expertise involved in sort of these broad planning efforts? Because I think what we find over and over is there's definitely a set sort of mindset about how these things get accomplished. We haven't done a good enough job in setting that vision of including the technical expertise from, and I'm seeing that we don't have an academic institution here, for example, and the great work that they can provide to us in terms of helping us address these problems. There's a level of expertise that I think we're trying to embrace in these broader efforts. I won't try to say anymore because I'm not supposed to be saying anything. So I did have 2 more questions back here, and I'm just going to keep going around the room. So Carrie.
Thank you. My name is Carrie Sutkin. I live in Elysian Valley, and I do thank FOLAR for convening this group. It's interesting and helpful, but I don't know how many people here are from LA City neighborhoods, but I would guess that maybe we're about 90%, and yet I don't see anyone from our city parks department here. I think there was a planning commissioner, but I think she's gone. And this is kind of the frustration, is that here we have this, with the exception of the elected official, but we have these really, and the journalists, we get a lot of the nonprofits that they come and you're nice and, have food and it's like this nice conversation, but, you don't have the power to implement. You have some contracts now with the cities and the county, and it's just kind of like, I think there's a little bit of a gap, because we're used to being activists with the nonprofits, kind of protesting a little bit on the outside, and now it's good to see that you're in, and there's millions, if not billions of dollars, and there is a county master plan that just kicked off last week. Let's not ignore that, and they're coming around again. So it's not for a lack of planning or agencies. I think we know the numbers. There's a cooperative committee and this committee, but there's still like, who's in charge? Why isn't the Parks Department here talking to us about this? Why isn't the Sanitation Department here talking? Why aren't, you know, to implement, you mentioned it earlier, we have to engage you, we have to engage our departments and our council people, and it's frustrating. We're in a period of growth, and it's confusing about the river, and so I'm not feeling like we're moving forward. You know, Marissa, we've had this conversation before.
Ooh, he agrees. Cutting the tension. Carrie, thank you for that question. So I think you're right. You know, I think it's really hard to feel like we are moving forward. But I think if you take the long view and look at sort of where the river specifically has come from, we have made a lot of progress. These agencies are talking more together and so on. But you're right in that some of the agencies that are in charge of the river or the land alongside the river aren't present in conversations like these. And maybe that's for lack of us, you know, staffing the panel that way. But it's also because, you know, actually the example that you brought up, the Parks Department, right? They actually have very little land in or around the river. That's not the agency that really governs the river. I would love that to be the agency that governs the river, but the agency that governs the river on the city side is usually the Bureau of Engineering. The agency that governs the river on the county side is the County Flood Control District. And so you have two agencies that kind of come at things in a very different mindset that I don't think are necessarily representative of everything that the river has potential to be. And so I think, and this is something we've long talked about, and Emily, you brought it up, and we have not made progress on it. We don't have a singular government entity to go to where the buck actually stops with them. You know, we could have the Parks Department up here, we could have the Bureau of Engineering up here, but they all have sort of their own mission and their own call to action. And so I think it comes down to that singular who's in charge. And there's not a good answer for that yet. There just isn't.
Yeah. I could just kind of see what you know, they used to say that about the county flood control district when they did their first community plan like 20 years ago, that everyone's in silos. And yet here they are 20 years later, and they're pretty seamless. They have a high quality landscape firm, they have geosyntac, they have these nonprofits doing amazing outreach. The county had to change. The city has to change.
I agree with you.
Is there a question here?
Well, I'd like to make an observation. I live in Los Feliz, but I've been involved with parks efforts for 60 years so far, and starting back in the 1950s with the Santa Monica Mountains Park Association. And
Sorry, can you make a little bit closer?
yes, okay. And what strikes me, I'm hearing the same things that we heard 60 years ago about the Santa Monica Mountains, and we worked it out. You've got to be persistent, you've got to be patient, you've got to be consistent, you've got to keep the pressure on, you've got to make good proposals. We made a proposal which turned out to be shot down by the Board of Supervisors to form a regional park commission, which they did not like because it was an extra layer of bureaucracy, according to them, but it triggered a whole cascade of other changes that ended up producing the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area, a master plan for the entire range of mountains going all the way out to Ventura County. So it can happen, and I would just encourage people to keep going.
Well, and I think one of the things that came out of that fight was the formation of the Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy and their JPA, the Mountain Zoo Recreation Conservation Authority. Exactly. So you do have this singular entity that you get to go to now
so
when something goes awry. Yeah, absolutely.
So a question over here.
Hi, my name is Karen Barnett. I'm also from Atwater Village, and I really liked, Laura, how you talked about connectivity, because I think that's super important. And I'd like to say also that the river has two sides, and they need to be connected. Now, I think in my community, one thing I hear is people feel they don't matter. They're disenfranchised. And I think there's a huge disconnect between even myself, because I'm on the neighborhood council, between the electeds and nonprofits. People don't feel like they can participate, they have opportunity, and maybe it comes down to time, but they always feel like, oh, we're left out, we're North Atwater, or we're left out because we're South Atwater. And I tell them, you're not left out, everyone is left out. Central Atwater too. Because for instance, we talk about plans and implementation, a lot of things have changed. For instance, in 2016, we found out that Atwater Village is in a flood zone. So no one is working on that. We haven't seen any plans change for that. And that comes down to multiple agencies. And it seems like it goes nowhere. Help?
Actually, Laura, I sort of want to punt that to you. So this is the issue of the Army Corps did a flood mapping study a couple of years ago that was pretty alarming because they actually had a flood model that showed all of the flooding that could occur throughout the Elysian Valley and Atwater Village areas. What that will trigger is these residents now being responsible for having flood insurance, which is pretty expensive, and FEMA will eventually redraw their maps based on this. So, you know, we've had these conversations with Karen before, we've talked about this. I don't have a good answer except that it seems like the city or the county, one of our local agencies, should be helping to resource these communities to maybe pay for their flood insurance, maybe update the river plan that shows how naturalizing the riverbanks can actually also increase flood capacity. And we haven't heard a good response to that.
I don't have a great answer for you because I remember we talked about this a couple of years ago, and I think at the time, you know, it was still evolving with the Army Corps, and it seemed like it was maybe connected with the project or maybe not. But I'm happy to sit down with you, and we should do this and get into it. You know, I know that there's much more county and Army Corps stuff, but if there's any way that I can help from Sacramento, let's do it. You know, let's sit down and problem solve. And even better, what I'd like to do is to do it with some of the experts from Sacramento, because I am not an expert in this area. You know, I looked once, and I live in the hills, and somehow I seem to be in a flood zone according to the insurance companies. They already canceled my insurance like 3 times because of fire, and I just live, you know, here, like right above the flats. But so I know this is like a huge issue. Insurance stuff is a huge issue right now across the state. I mean, with these fires going on, the idea that there can be insurance at this point in California with climate change and everything else, you know, I've talked to Allstate, these companies, and they're like, we just don't know, you know, that we can exist anymore. But let me sit you down with the insurance committee experts, either by phone or however you want to do it, and let's try to work it out. Okay? You have my commitment on that.
Another question right here.
Hello, my name is Eric. I live in El Sereno. Actually, work on hydrologic issues in the city of LA and San Fernando Valley. And recently a development that I've heard and talked about in the news and reporting was the potential feasibility of creating a joint powers authority over the river. And I wanted to ask, what's your take on that? Whether or not, you know, what you think that would look like, or how it would come into fruition. That's it.
So that's a really good question. Actually, Emily, you might know how that story has been being talked about in the news currently.
I have not reported on this, but I do have some what I think are concrete examples of times when that would have been helpful, which I don't know if that's what you want to know or if you would rather know more about the progress of where it's at. So you tell me.
Right. Well, more about, because I hear the issues that we're talking about being talked with, you know, the idea that we need to work more as a community together. And it seems like commissions and different associations need to be formed in order for things to move forward. So if that were to become a reality, what do you feel would be most helpful to be part of that authority or groups in that authority?
I can just tell you, and then I'll turn it over to you guys, that when I was reporting on like E. coli bacteria in the river and what was or wasn't being done to like notify people when it was unsafe to be in the water, it was like LA County Public Health, LA Sanitation, the Army Corps of Engineers, the Mountains Recreation and Conservation Authority, Burbank, and Glendale. And like they all sort of thought that the other one was gonna like do something about it. And so I think that having there be one person in that situation that could be like, okay, when, you know, when it's unsafe, like we're going to be the ones in control to warn people about this. I think that's the idea. And I think similarly with some of the development issues, like if there's one person in charge who can say, oh, well, they want to put apartments on the Glendale side, maybe we shouldn't also develop this open space in Los Angeles because the two cities might not be communicating really. I think there's things like that where it would be very obviously helpful to me. In terms of where that's at, do you guys know?
So the answer is sort of nowhere. It was something that was identified in the city of Los Angeles' River Master Plan that is now almost 11 years old. They did talk about and call for a formation of a JPA. It hasn't been a very popular idea among agencies that have power on the river because it comes down to really having to let go of that power and give it up to a central authority. So there hasn't been a lot of progress made in it. I am hearing that in the county master plan that's just kicked up, maybe that idea percolates back up. It's something that we're going to be watching for, but the agencies that would need to be involved in it are all of the ones that Emily just listed, plus the County Flood Control District, plus the Army Corps of Engineers, and plus Caltrans, because they're all landowners alongside the river. And so really, if you're going to have a truly powerful and sort of one-stop shop, you need everybody that has a stake in the river at that table. So you can imagine it's a heavy lift in getting all those agencies to agree, okay, we're all on the same page.
So I think we have time for just one more question, and then we're going to sort of just break and folks have, you know, independent conversations. I want to give everyone a chance to speak. To everyone individually, I think that was fantastic. And I think there's still some food left as well. So here you go.
Hi, my name is Melanie. It's really interesting to see that we're sort of, it seems like we're at the very beginning of a shift in the perception and conversation about the river from where it's been since the city master plan launched, which in my opinion is a bit overdue, but very welcome. Some of the stuff that continues that concerns me is that we're still hanging on to and have accepted the frame of the river is about housing. It is the city's plan. That's what the plan is for. But the county has now adopted the frame. In their master plan workshop, they're asking, what problems in LA can the river solve? Housing is on that list, which would be mind-bending any place else in the world. So I think moving away from that frame can help us consider the river as a river. I'm very pleased that climate was mentioned at least once on this panel tonight. In passing, Keisha, but once, thank you. We're talking about issues all around it, and Sharon brought it up with risk. We're talking about general plans. We're talking about insurance. How can you talk about these things and the river and not talk about climate change? We have to recognize that we are at Harvey risk. The arc storm scenario, the study done by the same people that did the Big Shakeout. The Big Shakeout report caused massive change throughout the state, statewide, countywide, citywide, with earthquake zone requirement changes. The arc storm scenario, on the other hand, then 2 years later has created nothing, no adjustments, no policy changes. We could have a Harvey happen here. the likelihood of an arc storm scenario happening in Los Angeles is equal to the big earthquake happening. We're not talking about that. The Army Corps flood maps have been held back for years in order to allow the city's plan to advance. We're building in at-risk places. We're not paying attention to what's happening with the NFIP and FEMA. It feels to me like an abdication of responsibility. We're having all these aesthetic and access conversations about how we're going to chart up this concrete channel. And we're not really recognizing what the river is, what its opportunities are, and what its risks are. Its opportunities for a network of park space throughout the entire county, and the massive carbon sequestration potential, and the groundwater recharge potential, and putting those open spaces in those communities that actually need them, rather than creating access to them with more bikeways and just fixing up existing parks, because, oh my gosh, it's so expensive. You're right, Laura, with the general plan being at the key of all this. The city started to do their general plan update and then stopped because the public got too engaged. The general plans are our only opportunity to address land use planning in the face of climate change. And the river is central to all of this. And yet we're still talking about anti-displacement and access. And I feel like we're starting to shift the conversation. But we really need to kick it into gear and put science to the top rather than engineers. Scientists, biologists, meteorologists, rather than relying on engineers to do this planning for us. And looking at what our needs are, truly what the river can do. It's one of our most valuable and dangerous, potentially, assets that we have here. It's central to our future in Los Angeles. And we're not talking about that. We're talking about the Olympics and bike paths and housing. There are a lot of amazing, exciting, incredible things to tackle. I just hope that this is the beginning of tackling them. And I hope, Laura, that you will also work with the senator's office, sorry to call you out, on some of these more critical issues. But science is at the heart of this. Climate change has got to rise in our priorities. The general plans are key. The state playing a role in this resource. I just hope that we can shift, and I hope I've given you enough to work with there, Emily. Thanks.
I would love to hear both of your responses to that, but I do want to say, Melanie is absolutely right. Climate change is real, and our river plays a big role in it. Right now, I believe that the county has a massive opportunity and potentially a lost opportunity to do real watershed planning. Part of the problem here is that we look at our river as sort of the largest and singular flood conveyance mechanism in our region. And it's never going to be big enough to take a Harvey-sized storm. It's never going to happen. The only solutions we have are to look at the entire watershed network and how we're making services all over the region permeable. Where else are we conveying floodwaters? Where else are we building stormwater retention basins? And those plans aren't interconnected, and I think it's a huge lost opportunity. But Laura, please.
I agree with you. Although I will push back and say that I don't think it's one or the other. I don't want to pit bike lanes against climate change. I think that we can have our bike lanes and still work on climate change. Most of the work that I do in Sacramento is around climate and water. And that's about 70% of my office's work. And I agree. I think that you really hit the nail on the head that we can't think of the LA River as our only, as this is what we do with water when it rains. We know that that was, a mistake, and it's contributed to a lot of problems in Los Angeles. And there is now a lot of work being done on permeable surfaces, on storage above the river, but it's not enough. I'll just give you a little anecdote. When I was in Glendale, I tried to do just a small, what I thought was a really no-brainer ordinance that all new development had to retain water on site. And I couldn't get it through the city council. And even when our engineers of the city said, this is like really easy to do in our city, our ground is such that all you have to do if you're like a big building is put a pipe 30 feet into the ground and you're done. And I still couldn't get it through. So that kind of resistance, I actually had a colleague, and I hate calling people out, but I had a colleague who said, I'm all for saving the planet, but not on the backs of the little guys. And it's like, do you even hear what you just said? So this is an imperative for so many reasons, not just because we have to address our resiliency as a community in the face of climate change. I was sorry to see that there was a coastal city recently that rejected a resiliency plan that was really looking at what was going to happen to their coastline and trying to stop development in areas that we know with climate change are going to be inundated with ocean water, that they refused to change their general plan based on that, which is, insanity. And still FEMA will have to cover those houses, and we all have to bail them out as taxpayers. So this is something that we all have to look at. We have to use science. We have JPL right here in the district who's doing amazing work with climate forecasting, with hydrology. And we have to be able to adjust our general plans, but also to look at water as that resource and to stop thinking that the LA River is going to be that overflow channel every time it rains, and to get water back in the ground the way it used to be 150 years ago in the San Fernando Valley, back when they grew orange groves with irrigation that was coming right from the hills, because the entire thing is a floodplain. I mean, we live in a Mediterranean climate, not in a desert. We've created a desert. My last little pet peeve, we have to green up the whole city. I was on the board of Metropolitan Water District, and I was always fighting against them that they were putting a dime into artificial turf when they would remove grass. Right. We need to have permeable surfaces, but also green surfaces that are real landscaping, that absorb carbon dioxide, and that create greenery, climate appropriate greenery. We're not Kentucky, but we can grow a whole lot of great stuff here. Why are we putting plastic? We banned it from bags, and now we're putting more of it on the ground. So that's my rant for the night. But so it's all connected, right?
I mean, I don't think it's going to get better than that. I think we should definitely spend some time processing this individually in small conversations. I just want to let's give a round of applause to the panelists again. And not for nothing, but give yourselves a round of applause for the great questions as well, and for the questions from the audience. I think this is exactly the kind of interest and passion that I think we all ultimately are trying to foster with this kind of conversation. This is ultimately about finding what those opportunities are, connecting with a lot of our local electeds, not just the nonprofits, obviously, but we have some great partners as well. So, and last but not least, I definitely don't want to leave Emily hanging out here, because I think definitely as a reporter, as a journalist, I think they play, again, a key role in this whole story, this whole narrative that really, I think it's important for us to continue to be in touch with and aware of. And hopefully, if she doesn't give you the plug, I'll just give it to you right now, but support your local paper. And your local radio station, sorry. Yeah, definitely. So with all that, again, thank you so much. We're going to hang around for a few more minutes to talk. And sorry, actually, MJ had one last thing before you go.
So can we give one more round of applause to our amazing panelists? We're so lucky to have all of you in our corner. It's awesome. And can we also give a round of applause to Stephen Mejia for moderating this entire thing? He put this whole thing together. He's the brains behind this operation. So yes, this has been a lot of hard work. I'll keep this short, but I know a lot of you, how many of you have been with Friends of the LA River for like a year? Have like been involved with us for like a year? Okay, over a year? Raise your hand. Nice. Okay, and I know firsthand there are some of you who've only been here for a day. Like this is your first day sharing space with us. None of this is possible without grassroots support. And I would love for you all to show your support by taking one of our remittance envelopes, our brand new shiny green and white envelopes, and making a donation to support our advocacy and our programming and our operational efforts. So please, we have a bunch of them on the table in the back. I will also have them with me. My name is MJ. I'm one of the newest members of the development team, and I would love to get to meet some of you on your way out. Thank you so much for coming again.